Hey, WTUFO fans. If you like the show and you want it to continue existing, head to patreon.com/WTUFO and support us for $1 a month. No special stuff, no gatekeeping. Just support the show for $1 a month to help it keep existing. Patreon.com/WTUFO. Thank you very much. What the UFO? I'm here with Kevin Wright. Hi, Kevin. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Caleb. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Sure, no problem.
So Kevin is a communications consultant. He founded Solve Advocacy, which is an issue advocacy and communications consulting firm dedicated to UAP and edge science issues. He advises the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, SCU, and he's on the board of directors and public affairs and public relations, and he's a consultant at the New Paradigm Institute as well. So you're on the board of SCU. Did I understand that correctly?
No, I advise the board on public relations and things like that, but not a board member.
Cool. Would you mind if we talk about your career to start? Like, how did you get going in public relations and communications consulting?
Sure. So, I started working in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2000. And, I worked in lots of different fields in political research. It's all been, political-based research, communications, public affairs. And after about 7 or 8 years, I decided to launch my own consulting firm, which isn't Solve Advocacy. It was a different firm at that time, working in strictly partisan politics. And then after a brief period there where I was engaged with that, I decided I wanted to not engage so strictly in partisan politics and branched more out into public affairs and communications and working with clients that weren't necessarily political, in nature in terms of identifying with one party over the other. And then a few years ago, I decided that, with my interest in UFOs, UAP, and other edge science issues, that, part of the process for, better government transparency and disclosure would be aided by applying some of the, political skills and expertise that I had developed over the course of, the last 20 years or so previous to that, and start, applying them to the UFO issue and to other edge science issues, consciousness, and things like that. So we better communicate with the public and with elected officials and make people understand better that these issues are real, and find ways of better communicating amongst ourselves, and trying to find ways to educate the public more, as well as members of Congress. So that's what the mission has been the last couple of years.
Wow, man, that's extremely cool, and very focused. Also, I'm curious about your early career. Did you come up working on campaigns? Was that what got you into it in the first place?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I was going to Arizona State University, and my first internship was with former Vice President Dan Quayle. He had a political action committee out there that later transitioned into his brief run for president in 2000, Quayle 2000. So I worked for the political action committee for a while. And then when I graduated from Arizona State University, I went to London to partake in a program called the Hansard Society for Parliamentary Government, where you take some courses at the London School of Economics, and then you do an internship with a member of parliament or another government entity. And so I did an internship with a shadow minister of the conservative/Tory party. And when that was over, I came back to the States, spent a few months with my parents, visiting friends and family, and then came to Washington, D.C., and I've been in D.C. ever since.
Nice. Did you grow up in Arizona?
No, actually, spent most of my youth growing up in Vermont, of all places.
Oh, cool.
So, the extreme Northeast, really cold winters, and then down to the Southwest where it's, extremely hot and no winter.
Flat deserts, yeah. I grew up in Northeast also. I'm in Massachusetts right now.
Oh, cool.
And we mentioned offline, we both have had some time in DC, although you've been there for 20 years. And
right.
Kevin and I found out we lived a block away from each other for about a year in 2003 or 4. Classic UFO synchronicity, or just regular life.
Or just happenstance.
Yeah. So that's an interesting journey that you started political and then kind of wanted to get away from it a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about the difference between communications consulting and lobbying, like where PR stops and like advocacy begins?
Sure. Well, I mean, in terms of, all of these things, whether it's lobbying or issue advocacy or something, obviously there's a communications component to it. But so I wouldn't necessarily separate communications from these other things. But with lobbying, that's a very distinct field to engage in, where you're actually going and speaking to, in this case, members of Congress and their staff, and briefing them on certain things, and then having specific asks that you're going to ask them to support a bill or something along those lines. Whereas issue advocacy, you're sort of typically trying to educate the public about something and then mobilize them to perform some sort of action that you're wanting them to do. So some of the issue advocacy we're doing now is educating the public that the UAP UFO issue is a reality, and that they need to engage with Congress to pass, say, enhanced whistleblower protection laws, or pass the UAP Disclosure Act, or any number of things like that. So that's more of the sort of the issue advocacy, where you're going directly to the people, whereas with the lobbying, you're going more to the elected officials. Although there is issue advocacy going on, Capitol Hill and things like that too. But that's sort of the best way to sort of break that down.
That's really interesting. And so you mostly are public focused these days, like building grassroots attention and interest, or do you still talk to some people on the Hill?
It's a combination of the two. I mean, we're actively engaging with the public. So some of my work, like you mentioned, was with New Paradigm Institute. So New Paradigm Institute has set up the Citizens for Disclosure movement, which is really a source of a grassroots thing that we're trying to build out in all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, and mobilize people to do letter writing campaigns, write letters to the editors of their local newspapers, go to town halls, ask questions, essentially build a movement where people are going to be demanding transparency and disclosure of what certain elements of the government knows about UAP. So that's really sort of the focus of that. But then, there's also the congressional component, where, we meet with a lot of offices, briefing them on UAP issues, and then obviously talking about some of the legislation that's going on Capitol Hill, like the UAP Disclosure Act, things like that.
Wow, that's cool. So you must have some sense of which offices are your favorite then, in terms of receptivity and knowledge about this issue.
I wouldn't say favorites, but there's certain offices that are certainly much more well-informed on the issue, particularly, in House Oversight, where, they've had two hearings now, last July with David Grush and Commander Fravor and Ryan Graves. And then, of course, the one from last week with Lou Elizondo and Michael Schellenberger and others.
And that second
Rear
one,
Admiral crossover.
Sorry to interrupt. The second one was a crossover between the House Oversight Committee and Committee for, I want to say, Cyber Technology. Is that right?
Well, actually, it was two subcommittees of the House Oversight Committee. So one was cybersecurity, and then one was national security. Subcommittees that were jointly holding this hearing together, but they're both under the umbrella of the House Oversight and Accountability Committee.
Okay, thank you.
So there's members that are parts of that Oversight Committee that have had greater exposure to this issue than, say, somebody that's on the Transportation Committee, or the Education Committee, or Veterans Affairs Committee, or something along those lines, where they haven't had to deal with it that much. So when you're meeting with those offices, you're sort of, by and large, often starting sort of from the ground up, or from the 30,000-foot level that you're giving a briefing without any sort of real fine granular detail. Whereas when you meet with some of the people from the House Oversight Committee, they have a much better working knowledge of the issue, and you can get down into more of the nitty-gritty details.
What about the Gang of Eight? Have you interfaced with these guys at all? People who should be theoretically read into a little bit more of the national security scoop than the rest of the Congress.
Yeah, I've had some exposure to their offices and had some briefings with them and discussions. They're very interested, of course, in the subject. Some are more interested in seeing where the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office goes with its new director. Others are more interested in trying to pass the UAP Disclosure Act. So they have a great working knowledge of the issue, with different, I think, ideas of how to get to the core issue at hand, which is transparency, not with just the American people, but also transparency with Congress, because by all accounts, many of these programs have been hidden from Congress, if they do exist.
That's interesting. And are you still personally ambivalent on that question? You're still holding space for the possibility that this might be kind of a game of telephone, as Arrow suggested last year?
I don't think it's a game of telephone. I mean, we don't know what we don't know. So it's impossible to say with 100% conviction, I think, that, it's, non-human intelligence. But I'm as close to certain of that as I can be without having, direct knowledge of that. Because I think that if you look through, the historical record going back to the 1940s, many of the descriptions that you see or that you read about today, including the 2004, Nimitz encounter with the Tic Tac, we're seeing similar accounts going back to the 40s and 50s and 60s of similar types of objects with similar types of flight characteristics. So if something were happening today, you could say, well, it's Chinese or it's Russian or something. That's, it's entirely possible and plausible, but that doesn't explain what was going on in the 40s and 50s when, we hadn't even launched, an ICBM yet, or Russia hadn't even put, Sputnik into space. So it's very difficult to make the case that that it's simply a foreign adversary or American, black budget technology or something. Although that certainly could be, much more the case, today than it was, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Are you familiar with the Admiral Hillenkotter quote about this from, I think, the 60s? This guy was the first head of the CIA. Does he come up in your communications research, or did he years ago?
Well, I'm sure that lots of these quotes get, passed around, continuously between, him and others that, either substantiate or refute, the claims. But I think if you look back through, the records of the various organizations that have been stood up to, investigate this, with the exception of Blue Book, of course, you find lots of evidence of, people, historical figures, talking about the reality of the UFO issue.
Yeah. You're right. It was silly of me to just say the quote because he spoke on this at length. But the two that it became important structural nails for me were he said the unknown objects are operating under intelligent control, and he also said that he knew that neither Russia nor this country had anything even approaching such high speeds and maneuvers. And I believe he's speaking in 1960 to this issue, but again, he was the first CIA director, so he's referring to the years of World War II and immediately following.
Beginning with, the atomic age, there were sightings, numerous sightings, hundreds of, UFOs, UAP, over atomic warfare assets, from the very beginning. That's, that includes, the mining of uranium, to the processing and enrichment of uranium, to, the assembly of, the core pits, to, rocket assembly, to deployment of these weapons. Every step along the stage, we saw UFOs appearing, monitoring, surveilling, whatever they were doing, going back to those days. And like I said, it wasn't just that, Russia hadn't put Sputnik in outer space yet, but it was also the fact that, China was going through the Cultural Revolution, and they were murdering all of their doctors and educators and physicians and scientists and everything else, in the 40s and 50s. And so, I mean, they didn't detonate their first atomic weapon until 1962 or something like that. I forget what the date is exactly, but, they were much further behind, than Russia, per se. And with the exception of Sputnik, the Russians were largely behind the United States, obviously, with the, advent of the nuclear bomb. So it's very difficult to argue that the Russians or the Chinese or something were deploying these sorts of assets over, U.S. nuclear facilities, and then having flight characteristics of instantaneous acceleration to, tens of thousands of miles an hour. It just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't seem plausible.
Strongly agree. And sometimes when I'm thinking about this, I wonder why this logic hasn't added up to more interest publicly. Because once you start looking at it, it all kind of clicks into place. It's more almost a problem, I think, of people's ability to focus on it. And I wonder how you think about that as a public relations person and as somebody who thinks about sculpting public opinion. Like, one question, this is maybe a little bit silly, but this came to mind earlier, if you had a magic wand made of money and you could just spend infinitely to kind of get the word out about this, what kind of campaign would you want to wage to raise public awareness?
Well, it'd certainly be, a public education campaign that would be a mix of, various media advertising, social media, broadcast, cable, etc. But to sort of go back to your original point, which was that how come it's not sort of more like, well known about all this? And I think it's because in part there is so much history. It's hard to sort of condense it all together so that people can be informed about it. There's so much history about it that you'd have to like really spend an enormous amount of time doing your own sort of reading and investigating about this. And it's hard to do that when your life is full of other things, of the have to do's and the want to do's. If it's not really on your radar. And then of course there's the fact that there was a disinformation campaign to sort of deceive the public, to make them think that the UFO issue wasn't real. So why would anybody spend any great deal of time looking into it if they were told that it was that there was nothing to it? They're not going to invest any time in that. And then so that's sort of also the problem here, where the Defense Department wants to make the UAP issue sound as though it's sort of a a modern era issue of like the last 20-ish years. That's why when they started looking at this again, in a more public way through Arrow and stuff, they started going back to the early 2000s and saying, oh yeah, we'll take a look at some of these issues, right? Well, what they're not talking about is the fact that the issues go all the way back to the 40s and 50s. They want to make it seem like it's something relatively new, and they're just starting to take a look at it, which of course isn't true because they've been taking a look at it since the 1940s.
Does this sound right to you as a guess about why they're being secretive? They don't want to reveal that they don't have operational capacity to confront this technology, and they don't want to verify for geopolitical foes that this technology exists because they're concerned that, say, China and Russia might shoot some down, make advances, and take over the world. Do those two things sound like the main reasons for Defense Department secrecy around this?
I think there's probably lots and lots and lots of reasons. I think certainly the two that you just enumerated there are highly likely, and definitely probably at the top of the the list. I think in part though, it is disclosure is a threat to the government institutions. If they come out and say, look, this is real, we've known about it since the 1940s, we've been lying to you all along, we've been hiding this technology, it's not going to sit very well with people. They've been lied to and deceived for 80 years. And there's probably also a lot of criminal culpability going on to keep all of these things secret for such a long period of time. There's been a lot of allegations of threats to whistleblowers and potentially even worse things done to people. So I think it's probably a whole lot of things, but I think the criminal components and the cover-up and the threat to the government institutions, their prestige and power are significant contributing factors to that as well.
On a personal level, has that ever made you nervous, working in this space, working in DC, kind of poking the bear? Have you ever felt any concern that these same powers that are intimidating whistleblowers might reach into your life in some way?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm just a guy that lives in Washington, D.C., works with some organizations, completely publicly and above the board. I'm not engaged in trying to get classified information. I'm not working with any whistleblowers. I don't have any sort of inside knowledge in those ways. So, I don't think that I'm a particular threat in the way that some other people might be. So no, I don't have that concern.
Okay, let me try to unnerve you a different way.
Okay.
There's, for me, been a process of moving from, oh, UFOs, what an interesting idea, to, oh, this is a real thing that's actually happening, and there's an actual physical truth to it. And there's like a psycho-emotional transition in moving between those worlds. And I've been wondering with everybody that I've spoken to, so I'd love to ask you, just how do you feel about that?
sort of like an ontological shock sort of thing when you
Yeah,
sort of
that is the
realize that
question.
it's all like real.
Yeah, how are you doing with your ontological shock to the extent you're
I,
processing it?
so I don't think that I really went through an ontological shock in that way. I was interested in consciousness studies and afterlife studies and that sort of thing. And that's how I sort of got into the UAP thing, because you kept reading and listening to people talk about how, there might be some sort of connection between the two, consciousness and, the UAP phenomenon. And so I guess it was kind of like, that seems really shocking, surprising. How can that be? But it wasn't really like a real ontological shock. What I would say, though, what has been more of an ontological shock for me is having worked, in Washington, D.C. for 20 plus years in politics, and, have a firm grasp of, how our democracy works and things, to come to the realization over the last several years that, the democracy that we've been led to believe in, that we live in, is not necessarily the one that actually exists today. That to me has been far more shocking. I mean, it's easy to sort of, lose faith and trust in your government and those sort of things, but it's different to realize that, it's not working the way that you've been told it's been working, because it isn't.
I strongly agree. It's been a real heavy hit for me too. I almost don't know what to say about that because it's so upsetting to me as a good governance guy. And,
and it would be to a lot of people to, sort of learn that as a fact. And that again goes back to, why the cover up, why the secrecy, is because of that ontological shock of, waking up one morning and realizing that, we're not really living in, the democracy that we thought we were. We have a lot of Machiavellian type of actors, buried deep inside the government as unelected officials, unelected bureaucrats, the real power brokers that sit behind the scenes and do have their hands on an awful lot of levers. I mean, that's not to say that we're not still electing people and that they don't have power and that they don't do things, they don't pass legislation, that presidents don't, make decisions of, life and death and war and things, because those things do happen. But there's an enormous power structure that's going on behind the scenes too, that controls the flow of information hidden behind, the guise of national security and sources and methods and all those sorts of things to hide, truths from you. They've sequestered science and technology. They have, quarantined off, areas of physics. And, there was a White House meeting earlier this year with Ben Horowitz and the other guy's name is escaping me, but I wrote about it in one of my columns. They said that they could, essentially classify whole areas of artificial intelligence if they want to. They have the Patent Secrecy Act. There's all kinds of stuff going on there that we'll never know about unless, somebody is able to succeed in forcing us into, the public daylight.
one of the first things that happened for me was a breaking of the word government apart, because I think people go to, how could the government keep this secret? And it's just not that simple. The government is huge. Some of these people are elected officials. They come in and out. Some of them are deep career officials who've been working there for 40 years. I'm curious what you think about the scale of sort of the inside operation, like in terms of people who kind of know the real dirt. Do you think we're talking about like?
Are we just talking about UAP here, or?
Yeah, I guess limiting it to just UAP.
Yeah, I have no idea. I wouldn't even venture a guess because, I mean, I would think it has to be, a relatively small amount of people. Obviously, the more people that know, the easier it is for something to leak out or something. So,
yeah,
is that a couple hundred people? Is it a couple thousand people? I have no idea.
Yeah, interesting.
I don't know.
And you think there's when you narrowed it down to UAP, you implied that there might be a broader world of things that people are keeping secret, like maybe consciousness research, like continuations of the Stargate project, for example,
like remote viewing and those sorts of things. Sure,
yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
It's upsetting just from a scientific plane, I think, because we grew up in a world where we thought science was a public good. And
right.
It's strange to think that somebody might be controlling that information. And on that point, I'm wondering, does it seem to you likely that the government bodies that apportioned scientific research funds have deliberately gatekept some of this information. Like you work with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. You know a lot of scientists who work in this field, or you know about their work. And I've talked to some of them, and they're having a hard time getting funding. Do you think these things are connected? Do you think the government, or the government again, do you think elements of the military industrial complex, gosh, all these words sound so big, have made it more difficult to access that scientific research funding?
It's distinctly possible. I can't say for certain with that, but I mean, the government, has essentially classified areas of physics and math and whatever else, then it would simply make sense that they have sort of steered science in certain directions and away from other things. And then, of course, that might play into funding as well. I mean, that would totally make sense, but I can't say for certainty that that's the case.
Okay. I'd like to move into what I sort of think of as like the third big basket of UAP stuff. And I'd love to hear what you think about my basket system. I sort of think about three big jobs for ufology right now. One is just getting the word out that this is a thing at all, informing people that this is a serious subject. Two is figuring out what's going on. And this is the scientific world, as well as the political world, as well as the historic research world. And then three is acclimating to the reality and building whatever institutions and structures we need to engage with the world as it turns out to be. And I wonder what you think about that third operation. I know that New Paradigm Institute is kind of founded with that in mind. So I'd love to ask you to just imagine rolling the clock forward a little bit. What kind of structures and institutions you think we need to deal with this reality in a public way?
Sure. Well, it's a very difficult question to answer in extent because, we don't know exactly what the answers are in terms of, non-human intelligence. Is there multiple things going on? Is it one thing? Is it malevolent? Is it benevolent? So without having any sort of real knowledge of those answers, it's very difficult to sort of say what that process will be. However, like you said, the New Paradigm Institute, one of its programs is, working with world religious figures and having discussions with them about how they can start having conversations with their denominations and their congregations and things about how do you start having these conversations about a non-human intelligence that, may be here and interacting with us. And then you start, talking about the academics and the scholars, working with some of them, and how do we start educating the academic system. So it's a multifaceted series of projects that have to sort of be stood up. And the good news is that there's several organizations that are sort of working on those things. Like you said, SCU is sort of working on the scientific aspects of the UAP phenomenon. But in terms of what happens after disclosure exactly, I think it depends entirely on what these answers are.
That's a good point. And you're right that institutions are doing some of this work already. I love that New Paradigm has been working with Ubiquity and teaching actual courses. Another group that I really admire is the Society for UAP Studies, and they've been offering courses too. I think you're right on about informing the academic world and moving this from just the kind of theoretic, like philosophy of religion space into studying history, and then even studying some of the technical science involved.
Right. So, one other example would be that, New Paradigm Institute partnered with a new academic, UAP group called the Visible College. And then we also partnered with the Yale Student Society for UAP and did a teach-in at Yale at the end of September. And those types of things, I think, are going to happen, more frequently around college campuses, making sure that people on these campuses understand that this is a real issue and sort of, bringing it into an academic discussion so that people can start feeling more comfortable and confident that they can have these discussions and not be, ridiculed or left off campus.
That's a great point. So is that part of your operations for the next year or two?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we've already had that one teach-in, and we've had discussions with Visible College. I'm not really intimately involved with that component of it, so I can't really say, where or when the next event will be. But they've been had those discussions in the past about doing them on other campuses. So I'll say stay tuned.
That sounds like a great idea. Well, just in terms of your daily work, would you be willing to give us a peek into like what your week looks like, what you're operationally engaged with at any given time?
Sure. So I have a lot of Zoom meetings with
Mhm.
people within NPI and stuff because some are in California, some are in Colorado and other parts of the country. We do have a DC office where Jim Garrison works. I think you interviewed him recently.
Mhm.
Um, so there's that, and then there's a lot of just general laptop work, and then I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill meeting with members of Congress and their staff, having discussions about the reality of UAP, especially when you're talking to the staff of members that aren't as well versed. Like I said, if they're not part of the House oversight or the intelligence or armed services committees, they're on transportation or something. You have to sort of have ways of broaching the subject with them. And I'll give you an example that, I met with somebody on the transportation committee, a few weeks ago, and, try to make them understand how it, plays a role with their, committee is that, the director of national intelligence, Aero, and others have admitted that, UAP is a flight safety risk.
Mhm.
So it's an easy way to sort of introduce the topic to somebody that's on transportation because they
Mm.
should care about air safety. And then you
And there's
talk about Ryan Graves and his organization and the legislation that they had sponsored last year by Robert Garcia on the Democratic side, and then Glenn Grothman on the Republican side to help streamline reporting by airline pilots to the FAA and that sort of thing. So you just got to find different ways of talking to members and their staffs and find ways that it will be germane to them and their districts and things like that.
yeah, streamline slash create a reporting system at all, as my understanding is that
Right.
we don't currently have a civilian pilot reporting system.
Right.
Is that
And then
right?
of course they have the fear of losing their pilot's license or losing their job or whatever the case may be. So yeah, that bill hopefully I would imagine will get reintroduced in the next legislation or the next legislature when Congress reconvenes in January with new members.
Have you talked to NASA at all? They mentioned in their study report last year that they would like to help with a reporting system.
I have not, no.
Is that something that any of the House and Senate members that you've spoken with have on their radar? Do they think about NASA and incorporating them at all?
Sure. I mean, the NASA had the UAP study group, and I certainly think that they have a role to play, and I think that a lot of members of Congress continue to think that NASA has a role to play as well. Sure.
It is an interesting challenge to operate in all three of these baskets at the same time, right? Like we can't just focus on processing and setting up institutions because we don't know all the things we don't know, as you said. And also, we're still onboarding people to the fact that this is interesting at all. Do you have a sense of that being kind of like a bottleneck, like the just raising awareness? Would you say is that like the most important part of what you're doing right now, or do you think it's kind of like evenly distributed? And
I
do they
think raising awareness,
here?
both publicly and within Congress are, probably where my focus mostly lies, because we want to make sure that people sort of get up to speed on the fact that this is a reality. But to do that, you have to find verifiable, data, facts, and figures to present them with to convince them that that despite what you've been told your entire life that this is all nonsense, it really is true. So getting past that hurdle is probably one of the biggest, bottlenecks, like you said, that exists is, and then convincing them that it's an issue that they should, care enough about to, actively get engaged.
Along these lines, do you do any media outreach, like to organizations that are covering or not covering this subject? Have you written op-eds for any media organizations, or do you pressure them in other ways? Like, is there a part of your operation that involves journalist outreach?
Sure. I mean, we send out press releases. They go on, out on press wires. And then I have my own, email distribution list that goes to, reporters and journalists, and then it goes to, podcasters and various people that are, in the community. It's, fairly large list, about 325 people, I think. Half of which are probably reporters that have covered, the UAP issue, both positively and negatively in the past. So we keep sort of in their ear about what's going on, with UAP issue, and then what the activities are with the various organizations that I'm associated with. So they're sort of kept apprised, even if they're not writing on it, they're sort of kept into the loop about what's going on.
Is there a good way for fans of the subject, people who might be listening right now, to help with this situation? And I'm specifically curious, do you think there's a right and a wrong way to approach media organizations if you're a fan or a listener and you'd like them to write and research more about the subject?
Yeah. So one of the most effective ways to sort of start getting, active in that capacity would be to write a letter to the editor of your local paper. And it doesn't take that much work, because they only take typically, something that's only about 200 to 300 words max. So that's not a very long letter. It's a, hey, you need to start, covering this UAP issue. Congress just had a hearing, what's going on here. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort, but the more of that thing that goes on, that the papers start realizing that there is a, an appetite amongst their readers about this issue, the more likely it is that they're going to start reporting on it as well.
That's a great point. And then in general, at a government level, I would imagine that you would recommend that people contact their representatives. Is that right?
Yeah. So, one of the things that the New Paradigm Institute has is they have a number of call to actions, asking them to use the email function on the website, for, like, say, pass the UAP Disclosure Act. There's already a pre-generated letter that goes, or email that goes to their representative, and then their two senators from their state. And all you have to do is essentially put in your information so that the representative and the senators, know that you're a constituent, and then you'll typically get back either an email or a letter from them, acknowledging receipt of your email. And so the more of that kind of thing goes on as well, the better it is, because then members of Congress have to start realizing that there is, a larger constituency out there, for this issue, and for particular, pieces of legislation, or, more support for more hearings, or, support to set up a select committee, or any number of things like that. So, NPI sent, I think, about, I don't know, like 37,000 letters, I think, to Capitol Hill.
Wow.
That's just taken off the top of my head. I don't know what the exact number is right now, but something along those lines. And there are other organizations doing the same thing. There's one called Declassify UAP, run by a guy named Nick Gold. His website performs, similar functionality in terms of, getting people to put their, name and address and contact information in, and then send a letter off to, members of Congress. And, there's a UAP caucus. They don't have that similar email function, but they have call scripts and things so that people can, call their representative or the senator in Washington, D.C., and talk about the issue. So, there's a number of organizations out there that are doing, great work.
And do you have tips and tricks as a communications professional for people who are UFO enthusiasts about how they should communicate with regard to this subject?
Well, I think you want to have authenticity and in your own voice, speaking as to your concerns and interest in the subject. But you also want to try to stick as close to, known facts and figures as you can. If you start going down, some different rabbit holes with a member of Congress or a paper or something like that, you're likely to sort of, lose them in that process. So, especially when you're first starting a discussion with somebody, try to keep it at the 30,000 foot level, before taking it down to the, sea level.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Right. That sounds like really good advice. Another clock roll forward here, and maybe this is heading toward a landing for us, is I'd like to hear if you have ideas about how, if at all, you would want us to engage with the potential non-human intelligence directly. If we imagine that the government and the military drag their heels on this subject and the scientists get some more data, but it's not conclusive, that maybe leaves us with option 3, which is some kind of direct outreach. And I wonder if you've thought about that and how you would like to see us give it a try. And if we had such an avenue, what you might want to say to NHI.
Quite a lot to unpack there. So first, I haven't really given it that much thought, but I've listened to others that have talked, about trying to initiate contact in some way, shape, or form. And some people are advocates of it, and some people say you should be careful. And I would tend to sort of be in the camp of you should be careful, because you don't know exactly what it is that you're contacting if you're successful, and you don't know what it is that you're sort of inviting into your life. And so, me personally, I would be very hesitant to engage in that. But, there are plenty of people that have, testified to the fact that they've had, great experiences with it. But there are other people who've had not great experiences. So I guess my thoughts on it are just, I would be careful about doing so.
That's interesting. That conversation comes up even when we talk about METI, which sometimes is an adjacent subject to this. Like, should we send messages to the stars? We might even want to be careful in that enterprise. So to imagine talking to somebody who might be here, it implies that we should be even more careful. I guess what I've been starting to envision is some kind of communication that could serve the purpose of confirmation as well, like not just for individual, because my read of the situation is several thousand people, maybe several 100,000 people, judging just by how many people wrote letters to Whitley Strieber and his wife, Anne, I believe, have had some form of communication. But what we've never had is a publicly confirmed communication. And we're starting to get some scientific research around recording some of these activities. And some people say that they're able to communicate with them. So maybe we can combine those forces and record a communication. Does that sound like a project that might be worth engaging with to you? Or do you think I'm barking up kind of a weird tree here?
No, I don't think you're barking up a weird tree. I have no idea. I don't know how to answer your question. I really don't.
Interesting. And if you had a megaphone that you knew went right to the NHI, again, hypothetical NHI, what would you want to say? What do you, as a communications expert, what do you think humanity should say in our first few public sentences?
Well, I think I'd want to know what the NHI was before I jumped into a megaphone and started saying something, especially if it was on behalf of humanity. So I'd want to know what the answer is before making sort of a judgment on what you would say.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier that you are very interested in some other kinds of edge sciences. Have those continued to engage your attention? And are you still interested in consciousness research and maybe, I don't know, astral entities and things in this area? Would you like to speak about that at all?
Sure. I still have a great deal of interest in that. I spend much less time, reading and thinking about those things because I just, I'm so occupied with other things. But those issues still interest me greatly. I worked with Julia Mossbridge a week or so ago and helped her get out a press release and things on a new project that she, is working on about setting up a program in the executive office of the president to sort of study some of these issues like remote viewing and things. So, I think those things are fascinating and they potentially have, real potential to affect, science moving forward and better understanding of some of these topics. So I'm very much still interested. I just don't have much less time for it.
Final question, grab bag. Is there anything that you would like to share about this subject that you think I haven't gotten to in this series of questions? Is there something on your mind recently about it that you'd like to just give a little oxygen to, or do you have closing thoughts on the subject, at least for this particular discussion?
I think what I'd say is that, last week we had that hearing in the House, and there were some people that were disappointed that there were no new bombshells or great revelations revealed or anything. And what I'd like to say is that we have to keep in mind that that hearing wasn't really for people that are in ufology, that are, well versed in, the history of it and the books and, all of the leading figures of it. And it's more about, trying to, get more interest amongst the public, amongst the press, and then of course, amongst other people in Congress. I think we also have to take into consideration those types of things when we think that, disclosure is stalled, or that, we haven't made any progress or anything like that. I would just say that, there's been an enormous amount of progress made, highlighted by the fact that we just had another hearing. There's going to be a hearing in the Senate tomorrow with Kirsten Gillibrand, with Arrow's new director. People are writing new pieces of legislation. There'll be new pieces of legislation coming out, next year. So I think that people should feel hopeful that, there's being progress that's being made. There are a lot of people that are, deeply invested in this, even if you don't see them, out in a public way. There's a lot of people working behind the scenes on this. And there's a lot more people talking about this, openly now, that we're not doing so, even just a few years ago. So I guess my parting, thought was that, we're making a lot of progress, and, sometimes it's hard to see that. And sometimes we take a couple steps forward and take a couple steps back, but we're still making progress nonetheless.
That's a great point to keep in mind. I wonder where you would like people to follow you and engage with you online. Is there a place where people can sign up for your newsletter, for example?
Well, that's a good question. I actually don't have a sign up, but you can reach me at kevin@solveadvocacy.com. I'm also on Twitter. I think it's Wright, WRIGHT research on X. And those are probably the best places to find me.
Awesome. All right. Well, we brought this in nifty and tight, Kevin. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for having me
with us today.
Thank you for having me. And good questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to meet you.
Great to meet you as well.
And that's the show. Thank you for watching or listening. Support us for $1 a month at patreon.com/WTUFO, patreon.com/WTUFO. Support us for $1 a month. Thank you very much.